Hello and welcome to Just Keep Writing,
a podcast for writers
by writers
to keep you writing.
I'm Marshall.
I'm Nick.
I'm LP.
And I'm Will.
And joining us today for week 4, just found out that there are 5 weeks in Pride Month this year. 5 Fridays anyway. Yay us. For week 4 is the inimitable Izzy Wasserstein. Welcome, Izzy.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm just so delighted to be here with you.
Well, we are so excited.
Yeah, we're stoked to have you. Can't wait for this. I may cut this, I may not. LP, you said 4 weeks in the episodes I'm editing, and I think it's funny because now we realize there's 5, and I think that's important. So we'll have a 5th episode this month, and that's the other thing. That's good.
Yeah, bring it on. Okay, Izzy. Well, welcome to the show. We're so excited to have you and really to dive in about your work. And this is a question we ask all of our guests when they come on. And it's a fun question. So I wanted you to describe your writing career in 3 words, and it could be completely unrelated, whatever comes to mind.
Okay. Well, I suspected you might ask me something like that. So I had an answer prepared for a different version of that question. This one is tricky. But I think 3 words. I think unexpected, queer, and messy maybe would be the words I'd pick.
I love those words. So
thank you.
Let's talk about the first one, unexpected. Why did that come to mind?
Well, I started my writing career as a poet, and that was what I did for a long time. And then I sort of rediscovered my love for speculative fiction. And I was like, I remember very distinctly hearing Sarah Pinsker read a story at an event, and like the top of my head exploded. And I was like, oh, you can do this with speculative fiction? Like, I want to think about what I can do with speculative fiction. And like, I still write poems occasionally, but I've really shifted my focus in that direction. And that's been what I've been doing. And at no point did I like set out where I was like, this is what I'm going to do. I just really loved it and really loved like the queer speculative community. And that's sort of how I ended up writing all these words of fiction somehow.
That's amazing. And what about queer?
Well, I'm one of those people who was a little slow to figure things out, right? I was into my 30s before I realized that I was trans, and quite a bit after that before I first found it in me to voice that to anyone but myself. And I knew that I was queer before that, but it was sort of an abstract thing, right? I was presenting as a man. I was in a relationship for a long term with someone who presents as a woman. It just wasn't like an active part of my experience. And then all of a sudden, I was like, oh wait, this is why I've sort of felt at a remove from my own life for so long. And when I transitioned, all of that just sort of like these like explosions of like, oh, this is what it feels like to live the way that's actually right for me.
And what about messy?
Oh, I'm just messy. You know, I guess I don't live for drama, like to the extent that intersects with messiness. But I am someone who always has piles of notes and papers around. I manage to seem like I have it together for my students, and then like mostly in my head, it's like the "this is fine" dog all the time, which is also partially just like living with anxiety, right? But yeah, I just think that I'm super messy, and when people don't know that about me, I'm like, oh, good, you don't know me well enough to know how messy I could be.
I get it, especially about the anxiety part. I think all of us in here have dealt with some type of anxiety for sure. So tonight we're going to talk about your short story collection, All the Hometowns You Can't Stay Away. and I wanted you to pitch the collection to our listeners. How do you describe it?
You know, I struggle with this. I've been asked this before, and I always struggle with it because, uh, short story collections come together. At least for me, this came together in a way that was some trial and error and thinking about what I had and how it came to get and how it fit together, I suppose. But the way I like to think about this collection and pitch it is, um, it is about uh, often messy and problematic queer characters doing their best in really terrible circumstances and sometimes punching Nazis.
Yeah. I like
love
that pitch.
Me too.
Thank you.
So, and then LP, you can ask the next questions, but I just wanted to let everyone know. So we're going to dive in specifically with 3 short stories of yours. One of them is the title, All the Hometowns You Can't Stay Away. And then the next ones are going to be Case of the Soane Museum Theft, and then Blade Stones and the Weight of Centuries. So they're the 3 that we're really going to deep dive, but we are going to talk about the collection as a whole, and I'm going to go right over to LP for this one. Go ahead.
All right. So your collection circles ideas of returning home and creating a better version of home. Was that like a design choice, or do your works gravitate toward those themes broadly? And in neither case, how do you think you ended up in that literary neighborhood?
Yeah. I mean, I think like the obsession with home in my work, which is there, and it was not something like I set out to cultivate, but is, I mean, I don't know how you all feel, but I'm a big believer in like the kind of stories that you need to write are going to reveal themselves to you, and you might as well not pretend that they're not, because like if you try to write things that aren't the stories that you need to be writing, they're not going to get written, or they're going to get written and you're not going to be happy with them. And I've lived most of my life in Kansas, and almost all of it, in fact, in Topeka, Kansas, which is a town that weirdly, if it's known at all, it's basically known for being home to the Westboro Baptist Church. It's like the like most homophobic people on the planet, maybe. And when I left, I was like, not only am I never coming back to Kansas, I left for grad school. I was like, I'm never coming back to Kansas, and I'm never going to write. I'm not going to be one of those writers who write about where they're from. And within like 3 months of leaving the state, I was writing about it again. And then I came back for a job, and then have been here for 16 years again. Please don't do the math on that, listeners. Like I or do, and then that's fine. It's not hard to piece these things together. But so I think that like what it means to have a place that is like deeply meaningful to me, even if it's not a place that I've always been happy to be from and to live in, is like a really fundamental part of my lived experience. And from talking to other queer folks, I think it's a common experience for lots of queer people, right? That like to both love a place or a community or something, and also to know that at some level it's not what it needs to be or what it ought to be. And so I feel like the title story in particular is me sort of wrestling with like what it is to know a place so well and to not be sure what to do with that, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if that answers the question at all, but that's what I got.
I mean, what I found was that the title story did a really amazing job of setting the tone. And I didn't realize that until I was a few stories in. But like I think it did a really great job of setting the tone of what to expect for the rest of the collection. So I'm really excited to hear that. Will you have a question?
Yeah, I guess maybe more of a comment. I'm not sure yet. Whatever comes out of my mouth. It's interesting that you said about going to the places that like we grew up and like having queer people exist, and a place, you love it, but then there's aspects of it that you don't. But by sometimes staying there that's how you can create change, right?
Mhm.
My experience has been I left home and I've never moved back. And so I'm always fascinated. And in some ways, I think it takes more courage to go back to those places and to like thrive, right? And to like change the system from the inside out when I just knew I will never move back there. Just will never happen. But I also see differences of like myself because I live in New York and seeing how everyone relates to me in that aspect from back home. Like it's like this great big like, oh my God, you live in New York. And then you're kind of like, okay, yeah, I guess it is a cool thing. I don't know. Go ahead, Marshall. It's just a comment, I guess. It was just really interesting reading your stories because I think we see that in a couple of the stories where the characters work within the system to start creating change, and it's not right away. So, okay.
Yeah, and I think I have a comment too. And yeah, I visited New York last year, and it is a cool place, Will. And I did get to see you, and that was amazing.
The
But
part seeing me was best.
yeah, so I think it's funny how I live in a small town, and I grew up in a small town. I don't currently live where I grew up. Some of my friends do still. And I told myself I would never go back. My parents moved out. Nobody lives there anymore. But what I found interesting is that I now live in a small town again. And I that first story really spoke to me too, because I'm like constantly confronted with ways to make this little, I'm gonna say, this little town that I live in. I was trying not to put something else in front of that. This little town I live in better for my kids. You know what I mean? And let them expect something that's not what I grew up with. You know what I mean? And so I think it's really interesting. I think that I don't think I have a question either, but maybe I do. The first story really it spoke to me in a way where, what if you had to keep going back, like keep getting confronted with this, like how to deal with that? So I don't know. I don't have a question. It was amazing. I really love that story. It turned out to be a comment, not a question. So,
Well,
but thank you.
thank you. I mean, I love comments, especially if they end with praise for my work. I mean, it's, I'm here for that. But yeah, I think my feeling very strongly is that people, especially marginalized people, have good reasons both to go and to stay. And I don't think that there's any. I don't think that one is inherently better than the other, right? It's like the omelas thing, right? It's like you can walk away, right, and that has its merits, right? And you can stay and try to change things, and that's also worth doing, right? And like people are doing what they got to do for themselves and for the way their lives take them. And sometimes you got to go back, and sometimes you got to be like, screw this, you will never see my face here again. Like, and I think that's all. It's all valid as far as I'm concerned.
For sure. LP, you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, I mean, we're just gonna dive into the conversation about. Oh wait, my next question. Sorry. Good idea. I was looking at the numbering system in this collection, and I can ascribe a meaning to it. And I know that you like to let people decide what things mean to them, but we're not talking about the stories. I'm just looking at the numbering system. How did you decide how to group these?
Yeah. So this is something that I learned from putting together poetry collections. And I'm going to shout out my mentor from grad school, Lisa D. Chavez, who is amazing and really took me under her wing when I knew jack and shit, right? Like, really, like, I was this early 20s white kid who didn't know much about myself, much less anything else, and she just made a huge impact on me. And so I'd given it a lot of thought, and I have a sort of a secret organizing principle for this book, and that is that there's this movement um, about loss and grief and trauma in the first section, and then radicalization in the second section, and community in the third. And it's not perfect. Like there's also like worked with Dave Ring, my editor, to figure out which stories like bounced off each other in cool ways to pair them and stuff. But in my thinking, this is like the overall narrative arc of the book, if there was one, which is really not probably, but to the extent there's something like that, it's like, oh my God, things are fucked up. I am so pissed off. I'm ready to burn it down. And then now I've burned it down. I'm like going to need a community if I'm going to do anything better than what came before.
Go ahead, Marshall.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, you mentioned Dave Ring. We've had him on talking about Neon Hemlock. So this question's in there. Do you care if I throw it out there, guys? I'm just really curious. Or we're really curious how you came across Neon Hemlock and that collaboration started.
You know, I had submitted work and David picked it for an anthology, and then I'd worked with him in a couple other ways, and just really was excited about what Neon Hemlock was doing. And from the very earliest days of my publishing speculative fiction, Dave was a big supporter of mine, right? And just absolutely was somebody who I knew that I wanted to work with every chance that I got. Admired his aesthetic and admired, like, I think my favorite thing about Dave is how deep his commitment to the community really goes. And I could see that from the diversity of the authors he'd pick and from the things that he was doing behind the scenes. And so when he expressed interest, he knew that I was preparing to shop around this collection. And when he expressed interest, I immediately was like, yes, here, please take a look at it. Please, 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 yes. And then tried not to like vibrate with excitement too much while I waited to find out if he wanted it or not. So it was just, it was just this gift that he gave me of, hey, I like your work. Could I see the full collection? And I could not be more grateful and pleased that it happened that way.
And yours is the inaugural collection from Neon Hemlock.
Yes, and I'm glad that there's another on the way, because my fear with all of this was that I was going to be the test case for Neon Hemlock publishing short story collections, and then everyone who could have published them with Neon Hemlock and didn't get to would be like, well, that's Izzy's fault because she hers didn't do well. It wasn't worth the time and money to publish. So I'm very pleased to see that it hasn't been a disaster for Neon Hemlock.
It was not a disaster. It was definitely a success.
Well, thank you.
It's definitely one of my favorite short story collections that I've read in the past 4 years.
Well, thank you so much. That means more to me than I'm going to be able to express here. I'm extremely.
You can't respond to every compliment because I'm trying to piggyback off Will. It's so tightly. What I want to say is that it's tightly plotted, but I guess a better way of saying is that it's tightly woven. Like while you talked about you'd separated by 3 specific like ideas, and obviously there's overlap from story to story, but like it just makes so much sense together. And then certain stories take place in the same universe. And I'm deeply impressed. I am not frequently impressed by short story collections because I feel like a lot of times they can be greatest hits. And this one is curated and it exhibits the care that went into it. So kudos.
Yeah, I feel like with this short story collection, you definitely get, the only way I can describe it, I'm a writer, I can write, I can use words, is like the energy behind each of the stories and the way it feels like this is an author who has a really strong point of view and the characters are so relatable. There's a lot of, even though while there's a lot of nuances about being queer and trans, there's still this universality that really, I feel like it really, everyone should be able to read this and be like, wow, it's just really beautifully written. The short stories. It's you, Izzy, Cameron Hurley, and then Sam Miller.
Miller?
Yeah. You're like, the three of you are my favorite short story collections like ever now.
Wow, I'm gonna make note of that in my. I have a little file I keep that's just like nice things people have said about my work for what I'm feeling down, and that's going right in there.
Amazing.
I was thinking, and I think this is a way to keep the compliments going a bit too. Nick has a question in there, and I want to kind of piggyback on that after he asked it. But let's dive into all the hometowns you can't stay away from. Nick, you got to ask that question that you put in there.
Ha! I'm being summoned. I like this. So I very much am interested in your POV selection for the first story here. It is second person, which sometimes I struggle with reading, but you did something very clever in there, and I'll read that part in a minute. But I wanted to know why you chose to do a second person POV.
And let me add something to that too, really quick, because I think this is the first time I haven't put down a second person story. The first time.
Amen to that.
Like as soon as second person starts, I'm like, oh, I can't do it. And I go the other direction. And what the section Nick's going to read is part of it, but I think has to do with the story itself. So yeah, go ahead and expand on that, please. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood. I'm happy to.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, you can answer his question. I'll stop gushing about the fact that I didn't put it down. But yeah, why did you choose second person for this story?
Yeah. So there's the highfalutin, like, well, this is my craft answer. And then there's a second answer that's equally true. So I'll give you the second answer that's equally true first, which is I'm happiest when I'm like taking on some entirely arbitrary craft choice for a story, and just being like, no, I'm going to tell a story that does this, right? I'm going to tell a story in the like collective first person or whatever. And so part of it was just like, I was like, well, what would a satisfying second person story look like to me? And then because part of this story for me is about the ways that like our past can feel like we've been locked into something, and simultaneously there are all these other ways we could have gone. I think there's like I thought it made sense to have the sort of somewhat coercive tendency of second person made sense in a story about like, is it possible to stop going home? Is it possible to go home? So that was sort of where I was at in terms of like, what did I want the story to do?
Oh, I like that a lot.
Go ahead, LP.
So,
oh no, Nick, you want to read the part first?
Yeah. So sorry, LP. It's a 2-part question here. So what I really liked, that it made it not feel like second person. You have this line in parentheses, and I'll read it here. It says, by you hesitate, I mean I'm hesitating. We all do what we must to survive returning home. If I say you're the one doing this, maybe I'll believe things unfold as they must. That was the key line in there for me, where I was like, I'm hooked. I'm way more invested into it now. And now I'm reading this as a self-therapy piece. I really love that line. What kind of made you kind of throw that one in there? Did that originally was your intention to have that line in there to change how people were viewing the narrator here?
I love that question, and I'm so glad that you liked that part. You know, I think that was actually one of the last things that got added to the story, and it got added because I was thinking about conversations I'd had with friends and with Iori Kusano in particular, whose work I'm a huge fan of and who is a lovely human being. And, you know, they had talked with me a lot about what they saw as the challenges of second person and the ways that it could lead the reader to places they didn't want to be in a way that wasn't super effective or super great in some ways. And so I included that in part because I wanted the story's structure to be like, I wanted to to pull back the curtain and let a little bit of the my thinking about what the structure of the story was doing be revealed there. And in part because I was like, oh, I think they'll like this particularly. Yori will like this particularly if I include this in the story.
Definitely a favorite part. LP?
I just want to go ahead and go on record on the podcast and say I think y'all are whack because this story was like
I knew he was
second
about to
person
talk smack.
from the very
I knew
beginning.
he was about to talk smack. I knew it.
It is what it is.
The second I saw your hand go up, I was like, he's about to talk shit about us not like a second person. Go ahead, please
I have
tell
an
him.
actual comment for experimentation, but I just needed to say that first because like y'all just need to get your shit together. Like second person is here to stay. You're gonna be okay. Put it down. You're gonna miss something, and it's fine. All right. Now that I've dismissed you.
Okay.
Yeah. So I love that use of second person in this story because I think it makes so much sense when when it's a character talking to themselves and about themselves, and they're actually encountering themselves in different spaces. Like to me, it would make more sense than any other whatever. Blah. But I also really liked because you referred to that as second person plural, right?
No, I was thinking about the Good Mother's Home story as a first person plural.
I led you into that. Thank you. That was such an amazing use of first person plural that I'd never seen before. And the way it was deployed it created a culture in addition to like letting each of the young women shine. And I don't know. I just love that. We're not going to talk about that story in depth, but I just thought it was very creepy and it kind of took me out. Okay.
Go ahead, Will.
So, with all the hometowns you can't stay away from, too, when you were creating it, was it the idea of working in parallel universes, like at the forefront? Like, how did the creation of the story come to you?
You know, I'm going to do my best to give you the best answer as I remember it, with the major caveat here that my long-term memory is poor, and my long-term memory of anything before lockdown is like, haha, who knows? But I was really, I really wanted to think about like what it meant to sort of confront the choices that you'd made and the ways that your life had spun in certain directions because of things that you'd done, some of which you might regret, some of which might have been really hurtful to people. But also just like the sense that at some point, that my feeling anyway, is at some point, like you have to make a choice and there's limited benefit to, trying to imagine what would have been different if you'd made a different choice, but also like, I don't know about you all, but like, the way my anxiety manifests means I can't help but thinking about all the choices I made, or just like worrying that the dumb joke I said with my friends like didn't land or whatever. So I think the protagonist in that story is way cooler than I will ever be, but we have in common this like obsession with wishing we could go back and tinker with the past in some way, or go to an alternate reality where you just did the thing right in the first place.
Do you feel like writing the story had helped you release anxiety sometimes? Or writing in general?
Oh, that's a great question. I think so. I think, two things that I don't always like to do while I'm doing them, but that I know I'm the best version of myself when I'm doing, is regular writing time and trying to go out for little jogs. Like, I know I'm happier when I do those things, and I'm not always doing them. But so I think in that sense, like, even when I'm furious with the story, when I get to the end of a story, I always feel great. When I'm like, okay, I did the thing, now it's ready to send out. That's a good feeling. Even if in the middle of it, like you ask any of my friends, they'll tell you like, oh, Izzy's gonna probably have a meltdown about this story at some point. It's just that kind of story. Like, it's coming. We'll have to deal with her like being on aren't in our mentions being like, I'm doomed. What am I doing with my life? So, I mean, that's a really fair observation about me.
I feel like that's the life of an artist. It's just when you're creating and making stuff, I feel like that's just what we go through. Any other questions about the first story, cast and crew?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Multiverses are particularly au courant at the moment between the next phase of the MCU, everything everywhere all at once being a juggernaut that took over the world, right? And while we're seeing these things in real time now, this collection is a year old. So I'm curious, what led you to a multiverse story versus any of the other stories that it could have been?
Yeah, time travel stories tend to frustrate me unless they're not taking themselves too seriously. Like, it has its problems, of course, quite a few of them. But one of the things that Back to the Future does is like the central conceit of like the photograph fading away, like that doesn't make any sense. Like, if you stop to think about it for 3 seconds, it's like, well, why would they fade out instead of just disappear where the past changes, right? But like, whatever, it makes visual sense for the movie, so it works, right? And like, but like, I don't know, time travel stories give me a headache, and they're fun for me to read, but I didn't want to tackle that. Whereas like, I feel like there's something about my experience of queerness that fits really nicely with multiverse stories. And I think that it's knowing that, like, right, if I'd grown up differently, maybe I'd known that, like, being trans was a thing someone could be when I was younger and wouldn't have felt like I spent my entire young adulthood, like, not understanding myself and not being in touch with who I was. And so, stories about, like, well, somewhere out there's a version of somebody who, like, just did the damn thing, I think had a ton of appeal for me.
I love that. I think sometimes it's like we look back and especially grown up queer, like you grow up and be like, wow, I just didn't have the language to know those things. And it's kind of like I always think about, like when I personally write, I always write for the younger version of me to be freer and to feel
I love
loved.
that.
And it's constantly like in my work, I think I've realized that I'm constantly writing for that younger part of me so that they can heal. Because sometimes when I look back at the things I've been through, it's like I'm grieving for another person.
Mm.
And I'm
Yeah.
trying to write to heal that person, because today I'm fine, but I know that version of me back when I was a kid was not okay.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. I frequently just think about like how one of the things I want is to just like hold some grace for young Izzy. It's like there was so much that she was fucking up about and she didn't know it and she didn't even have the tools to know it yet, and it's like I think it's either be angry at that self for me or have empathy for her. And so I prefer empathy to anger most of the time.
Yeah, I think, and our other co-host Brent's not here today, but I feel like what I've learned from Brent is that the moments that I could get angry with my younger self, I don't deny it and I transform it into justice. I take maybe that anger that I could have for myself and instead transform it into something productive like justice. Well, it's thinking about the rights and the wrongs in the world and then trying to make them right. That's what I feel like he's always taught me. All right, I want to segue into our next short story, The Case of the Soane Museum Thefts, which I
love this story.
Love this fucking story so much. I just really want there to be a whole book series with this character. So, my first question, sorry, I have to look at my question because I made it so in depth. All right. So the Case of the Soane Museum Thefts. I look at it as the characters are great, but it's also about culture and the robbing of the indigenous people what is rightfully their own. When you were crafting this story, was there a theme in mind, or was it the characters that came first? And then the kind of the theme enrolled out of those characters?
This is, I think, the only story of mine that I can think of where the answer to that is neither one of those things. That what came first for me was I was like, this place is so weird, this museum. Like, I need to write about it. I visited there on a friend's suggestion when I was in London, and it was the coolest and weirdest thing that I saw in London, and it was simultaneously breathtaking and strange, and also like I would say you couldn't ask for a clearer like emblem of colonialism and British colonialism in particular, except I also visited the British Museum where they have like a big plaque explaining why they feel like they should keep all these ancient Egyptian artifacts, right? It's like, yeah, I get it. It's because you like them and you don't want to give them back, right? Like, let's just be honest about what's happening here. So it started with, I want to write about this place. And then it was, well, what do I want? Like, do I have anything to say about it? And so then it became a quest to like, I was like, I am a white woman who born in the heart of America, right? And so I'm like, I want to write a post-colonial story. And if I'm going to do that, I'm going to have to teach myself how to do it because it is not from my positionality exactly or at all, really. So then it was just like, okay, what kind of narrator do I want? What kind of plot allows me to talk about the things that I care about?
Did that make you nervous?
Oh my God, so nervous. I mean, I had so many pairs of eyes on this. I have never before or since written a story that took me longer or that went through more radical changes than Soane Museum did. And it was, I'm really glad for it. Like, I'm very pleased with how it came out, but it was incredibly stressful, right? Like there's a sense in which I'm like, maybe I shouldn't have been writing it at all. It's not really in my lane. But then the alternative was, okay, well then what am I going to do? Never write about like the problems of colonialism? Because like that, I wasn't interested in that either. I didn't want to be a writer who didn't take things on if I hadn't been directly harmed by them.
I think, like, how did Rivka, am I saying her name right?
Mm-hmm.
How did Rivka come to you?
Well, I am Jewish on one side, and so Rivka and I's experience overlap quite a bit. There's other ways in which we don't overlap, but I wanted a character who had a background that connected her to these things that she was seeing and experiencing, and that was an outsider to them in some significant way. And I had been struck by the fact that the museum does, in fact, have a copy of Josephus's History of the Jews. And that gave me a way into the character to be like, oh, what would that experience be like for her? Would it be like what it was for me to see that? Would it be different? And then I sort of worked backwards on who is she? What does she want? And what's stressing her out enough that she's going to put up with the bullshit of these like stuffy white men who want different things from her in the story, at least for a while, right? Because she's got to get paid because she, right, can't put food on the table at the moment.
Yeah. This line, this made me also kind of laugh out loud, and I just loved it. Since no one lived on the premises, this meant only the director himself could come and go as he. Always it seemed he pleased. Like, that just made me laugh, and I was like, yeah, you're right. It always does seem like to be a stuffy white man. But, when you're writing outside of, like, your culture and your gender, or anything. Like you're writing the other, someone who is not you. When you were writing this, were you like, if I'm going to put this out in the world, do I have to, will you accept even the negative comments that could come your way? Like, how do you, as a creator, view that, say, if you've gotten negativity?
I have been fortunate in that when my work has gotten heat, it's mostly been from people who I was delighted to piss off, right? Like right-wingers and stuff like that. I am sure that the time is coming where I will publish something and somebody either privately or publicly will call me out and be like, Izzy, you really screwed this thing up, right? And I hope about myself that how I will respond to that is listen attentively, say, thank you. I hear what you're saying, and I'm going to commit to doing better next time. Because I think to take on things outside our experiences, we will get it wrong, right? Like, in fact, one of the things I have noticed is that like the trans folks that I know spend so much time like seeking feedback from people who have very close but different experiences of our marginalizations in all these ways, right? So like I've had people be like, "Hey, could you get a look at this? Like, I'm trans feminine, but I use they them pronouns, and I'd really like somebody with she her pronouns to look at this and make sure that I'm not screwing it up, right?" So like you do the work, you interact with people who you trust, who have experiences that are relevant to the story, but also like you got to accept that. I got to accept that I'll put it that way. I have to accept that I'm going to fuck up, and that that's not an excuse. But it's a reality, and so I need to figure out how to accept somebody calling me out for it with grace, hopefully, and like hoping that that I don't know how to end this sentence. I'm rambling. I'm gonna stop.
I don't think you're rambling at all. I think these are, it's hard. It's a hard question, and we're writing the other, so we're trying to do our best to learn and grow, and we will get it wrong or we will get it right. It's a lot like life, double-edged sword.
Absolutely.
Marsh, you had a question?
So I want to make sure we have time for the other story because that other story is absolutely brilliant as well. But I'm curious, and I have a similar question with the other story we're going to talk about. But it's tough to do what you did in a short form. Like mystery in a short form is not very easy, in my opinion. I've tried it a couple times and failed. But what I'm wondering is when you're also talking about speculative writing in short form mystery, like how did you? And we've talked about pop culture a little bit tonight, so I'm gonna throw this out at you. How did you decide on how you were going to make the paranormal aspect work in this story? Like, what are the rules? Like, you laid it out, it all flowed beautifully, but like in your head, what were you thinking as far as, okay, this needs to work this way for the story, or is this the way I think ghosts and such should interact with someone who has a sight, kind of thing? If that makes sense.
It does. In this story, it was mostly reverse engineered to be like, well, what makes this interesting? What creates problems so she can't solve this immediately, right? I realized very early on, I'm like, oh, security cameras are a problem for this story.
Sure.
So the reason that supernatural entities and ghosts don't show up on the cameras in the story is because if they did, there's no story, right? And I didn't want to write a scene where they like shatter the glass case around the sarcophagus. So I was like, well, I'll just use the thing about like ghosts being able to like pass through physical objects. So on this one, it was just like a mad scramble to make the plot make sense because plot is not my strength. And I was like, what have I taken on here? and just had to sort of figure it out as I went.
You could have fooled us on the plot thing.
Yeah.
So
Well,
this
thanks.
might be a spoiler for the listeners, but you need to read the book. Safia, am I saying her name right, or is it
In my head it's Sophia, but
Sophia?
yeah,
Okay,
but
great.
it could be whatever you like it to be.
No, I don't. I mean, I just want to get the name right. She has this really great. I feel like they have a really great rapport with each other. Safia and Rivka, like the way that it ended, I felt like, oh, these two are going to be besties, you know? And so my question is, are we going to get like a book with them?
You know, I hope we will see them in some fiction in the future. I don't think I'm done with them as characters. I haven't yet figured out what the story that I want to tell about them and with them is next, but I do like them, and I think they have a fun energy together, and I think they're going to get up to a lot of other shenanigans. And so I do want to see what those shenanigans are, and I hope someday they will reveal to me. If I may get like this is the wooiest I ever get is when I start thinking about like, oh yeah, my characters absolutely are like, no, Izzy, you got to do this. Like, we're not going to stop bugging you, and those two have that for me. So I'm hoping that more comes from them, and I
love
expect
that.
it will.
Because they have such a great rapport together, and the way it ended, I was like, oh, I want more. Marshall.
So real quick, I think we might be overzealous trying to get 3 stories in, but let's do it anyway. So let's start talking about this last one, because off mic, Will and I were talking about how much we love the Blade story. So let's jump into that one before we get to the end. Huh?
Yeah. Do you want me to ask the first question?
Yeah, the glare is bad. I can't tell. Is it me or you? Do you have a question? Yeah, go
I
ahead.
have a question.
Go ahead.
I always have questions.
Yeah.
What are you
I
talking
know
about?
you do. Go ahead, buddy.
All right. So we are talking about blade stones and the weight of centuries. And to me, the story is about privilege and how people who are in power can help the common person, right? My question is, talk to us about like creating Edge and the princess. You know, did Edge come into your mind first? Was it the princess and you wanted to kind of like flip the script? Because I feel like, especially around, there's been a lot of talk between nepotism, you know, and nepo babies. And I kind of think of the princess as kind of like, you know, she's a nepo baby, you know, but what I loved about the story is there's so many things that she doesn't know because of her privilege, you know, and then Edge is coming in here and being like, oh, you are just as much as a cog as I am because you're sheltered.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I am a pretty privileged person, right? I'm someone who has, you know, all of the privileges associated with whiteness and who, you know, came up in an educated family. So I had people in my life to help me like pursue my own education and, you know, could help me when times were tight financially, right? I had this overwhelmingly huge privilege of being able to take on risks that otherwise I couldn't have taken on because I knew that if the worst came to worst, like I could go crash on a family member's couch, right? Which is just this huge thing that not everybody has access to. And so, yeah, I really was interested in that. And while I don't think that Princess Mara I don't think that she came first in the story. She is the one who I most strongly identify with, right? Of somebody who realizes belatedly how complicit she is in a power structure that is doing immense harm and has to figure out what to do with that knowledge, right? And I think that's a space where, like, people from the US, especially like white people, like, I mean, just taking up the resources that it takes to live in the US, right? Like, on a global scale, that's contributing massively to climate change and to inequality and all these other problems. So so that she became a really important character for me, but but it was Edge who came first because, and this is a much less sophisticated answer, but it's very true, is that like, I was like, I very rarely get to see trans women who get to be like awesome, badass sword fighters. And everybody should get stories about people like them being awesome, badass sword fighters, because like we all deserve that. Like, everybody needs. I think everybody deserves to see themselves reflected in like cool sword person stories.
100%. Yeah, I think we all agree with that one. Marshall, you had a question.
Yeah. So again, you do this thing where you have this short story, and you have all this culture built in there, this empire, and then there's also a magic system in there. So you do a good job of kind of, I know it's a short story, but I have to feel like there's a bigger magic system where you did a really good job of showing us just what you needed to. But like Will said before, I really want to see more of this world. But like, what's your inspiration or thoughts around the magic system and how you came up with that and making that work with the characters?
And I see LP wants to follow up, so
It's in the same universe as the crafter at the web's heart. So what I loved about this story is that the story that came to before it teaches me what I need to know about why her hand doesn't turn back to skin. I was like, oh, this is great. I love this. And I figured that out before I went and read the story notes at the end, but I was just like, oh, this is great. So we've gotten an opportunity to see this world from the Emperor's Pyramid, but also to these streets of Traverse. And I was like, oh, that's cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I had so much fun with this magic system, and it came out of a conversation I was having with friends actually at Clarion West about like, could you do second world fantasy with its own magic system in short story form? Because it's so much to have to do. And so with Crafter, I set out explicitly to do that. And then each time I've come back to that. So I came back to that with this story. And there's another story, Vixen with Death Pursuing, that I thought was 3 of these stories was too much for this collection. But I think it's a fun story about someone who practices fox magic trying to save her girlfriend. And that's out in the world too. But I
Fox
just,
magic?
yeah, because in this world, right?
You
In the world
threw
of
the
these
fox
stories,
magic at us, but go ahead.
yeah.
Casually.
Well, that's what I love about this magic system, is that literally any kind of magic is possible as long as you identify strongly enough with the source of that magic, right? So, like, if what you do, like Edge, is lay awake at night dreaming of using your sword to right injustices, right? Then you will, you can do that as long as you're willing to. But like, in doing that, it's going to change you. And so that's what I love about it, right? Especially because so much of the discourse about magic systems is about the cost of magic. And like, I understand from a narrative perspective why costs, like having a price to pay for magic, is an important storytelling choice, right? But I also am like, yeah, except not everything needs to be fucking capitalism here, right? That like, that's a super capitalist way of looking at it, is that you have to pay for the thing. And so I wanted a system where it's like, well, whether this system is a cost or not depends on whether what you're transforming into is a problem for you. And if you're poor and trying to keep your neighborhood fed, maybe it is. Maybe you don't want to become a tree, as a character in Crafter does, right? But if what you want more than anything is like to be a warrior, that's available to you. And as a trans person, it's like, yeah, I'm always suspicious of narratives where like there's something inherently bad about change.
Go ahead, Will.
I mean, it just makes me think of like trans kids, now that they get to grow up and see themselves. And I think a lot of Marshall of Zoe about all the things that he's going to have. Marshall has a trans son. And I just think of Zoe so much in like a lot of the stuff I'm reading because I'm like, thank God he has parents that allow him to be himself and that he is going to live in a time where he can just see the adventures that he gets to have. And that just makes me, with everything else that's terrible going on in the world with queer people and the attacks on trans rights, that the trans youth still have this sense of storytelling that they will be able to use story as a means to go through even the awfulness of what's happening with our laws right now and be their own heroes and get to see themselves reflected in so many ways. I just love that.
Oh, I do too. That is so well put. Thank you for sharing
buddy.
that. Yeah.
Go ahead, LP.
One of my favorite things in fiction, particularly speculative fiction, is that is moments of authenticity. And one of my favorite writers is Sam Asher, and like in all of his stories, there's this moment that says something about the human condition that is very like is so knowable, but like had never been put into wordsable. And you have one of those moments in the story. It is on page 124 where Edge says, "You nobles are always the same, so concerned with the cost of change and not at all with the cost of carrying on." And I just thought that was deployed perfectly in the moment, but also just like, this is the problem incarnate, like put into like two very strong sentences. It's like, y'all do this shit, but also like, we don't even know what the cost of changing would be because we're so busy carrying on. So I wanted to point out one of my favorite lines in the book.
All right.
I don't know. I could talk to you all night, Izzy. Thank you so much for this. This has been awesome. And your work is amazing. We have one more question, but before that, we always ask, where can people find you and follow you online? What you have coming up next, stuff like that, like social media, stuff like that. Just so we can put it in the show notes and people can follow you if they want.
Yeah. So first, I'll start with what's coming out next. I have some stuff coming out in a couple of different anthologies that you can find all the details about on my website, which I'll get to in a second. But I also need to make sure that I don't leave here without mentioning that next year, my novella, These Fragile Graces, is coming out, and I am super excited about it. It's a cyberpunk murder mystery in which a trans woman returns to the commune that she left when many years ago now to investigate the death of her ex-lover. One second here. Sorry.
That was called These Fellow Graces, you said?
These Fragile Graces.
Fragile Graces. Okay, well,
that's
we're going to
amazing.
have to talk about that when that comes out. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned that is with Tachyon, and I'm super, super excited about it. It's there for all your messy queer anti-fascist needs. And then IzzyWasserstein.com is where you can find me. I'm on Twitter occasionally at IZZYXEN, and on Mastodon at IZZYXEN at wandering.shop. Although I, mostly stay off the bird site these days, but like I do try to keep people updated on what's going on with me there.
Nice.
Awesome. All right. I didn't assign the last question to anybody. Who's up?
I think
I'll take it.
Yes,
I'll take it.
Go
Look,
ahead.
they
Nick.
ask so many
You
wonderful
go.
questions. Sometimes I can just sit back and be like, oh, I'm just going to listen and enjoy this episode in real time. It's wonderful. So this is our favorite question. Well, at least one of my favorite questions to ask here at the end. But what keeps you writing?
Love that question. What keeps me writing is that there are lots of things, but one of the big ones, and like maybe this is a thing I shouldn't like admit when things are being recorded, but when I'm really low, which does happen, and there are times where like my life is busy and I feel no creativity and I'm not writing and I feel pretty miserable. And one of the things that always helps is I'm like, I have friends and community that will notice if I'm not doing the thing. And I want to remain part of that conversation. And frankly, I don't want to look my friends in the eye and be like, nah, I gave up. Like, it was too hard. I stopped, right? Like, I just decided, to pick something entirely random, not at all to do with the date when we're recording. I just decided I was not going to try to write. I was just going to play Diablo 4 for 2 months straight. And, if I didn't have a community, like, I may do a little bit of that. Maybe not, but
gaming's okay.
For me, a big thing that keeps me writing is like, I want to continue to do the thing and talk to people who are doing the thing and read their words and try to write things that the people that I most admire are going to like. Try to write things, right? Like this, I've said this before other places. And, if like cishet people like my work, that's really cool and I'm glad. But every time I sit down to write, what I'm trying to do is do justice to the queer community and to the trans community. And so when, I just often enough, I get those little jolts of like, oh, something I wrote meant something in a way that people, and now I'm rambling again, but that when I was a kid and to this day, I'll read things and I'm like, oh, all I want in life is to move someone the way this moved me, right? Like I want, like for me, the end of the last page of Left Hand of Darkness is like one of my all-time favorite endings of anything. And it's like, it recontextualizes what you've seen and it's just really powerful. And I'm like, what I want is to approach someday like giving someone the emotional hit that I get whenever I encounter that.
I could hug you. I know. With permission right now. This has been such a good interview, and I really appreciate you coming on. Like, I'll douse you with compliments now. I love that you came on and were able to share and talk about your stories, and they're so impactful. And I really love that you are putting yourself out there and trying to be a hero in some way to represent trans folks. And I love it. I'm tearing up over here. So I'm going to move on to the next person.
Well, and I just want to, and like what Will said earlier, it's, with my kid and stuff, I'm so appreciative of what you're doing. So I can't wait to share your stories with him one day. He's a little younger at the moment, but I can't wait. So thank you. Keep doing it. And we got to have you back. Talk about this cyberpunk story you talked about, because that sounds phenomenal.
Thank y'all so much. This has been such a delight, and I couldn't have asked for better and more wonderful questions. And y'all are awesome, and just like keep being awesome, please.
We will do our darndest.
Thanks so much for coming. It was fun. We had a good time.
What's the pub date for your novella?
I don't know for sure, but probably next summer is what we're looking at. And I will crow about it as soon as I know. As soon as that's settled, I'm gonna be out there hyping it and seeing if I get canceled for this one. But that's a story for another time.
Indeed. And this has been Just Keep Writing, a podcast for writers, by writers, to keep you writing. You can find us at justkeepwriting.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Feel free to reach out to any of us on our social medias, and please jump in our Just Keep Writing Discord channel. Links to all of that is in the show notes. Lastly, please support our show by going to patreon.com/justkeepwriting. We offer daily writing prompts, early access to podcast episodes, and much more. Thanks for listening, and just keep writing.